Hello, 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 hello. Hello, and welcome to. Hello, and welcome to. Hello, 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 and welcome to Cartoon Kabala, Kabbalah, Kabbalah, Kabbalah. Coming at you live. This is the pre-up, the pre-down, the pre-game, the on-go, the on-go, the on-go, the on-go, the on-go. Scheduling for 2 minutes, throwing down 2 minutes. Bum dum bum bum bum. Ba na 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 na. Ba 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 da ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 da ba. Ba na ba da ba. Ba da 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 do 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 do. Adaptations are the main thing we started the Pop Cartoon Kabala project around. The mystery of adaptation, because the mystery of adaptation is, the fundamental story and mythology of creation, right? God adapts God to make an extreme of ungod that mirrors God and reflects God. And that's the fundamental underlying theology of repetition as the fundamental work of creation. Vishinantam, you change it up and you make it go. Baruch Meshane Habriot, Shona Halachot Kol Yom Uvtachlo. The beginning of growth is finding new and better principles. Yeah, and they're mostly isolated. What are principles and rules? They're basically isolates of observation wisdom. You have like a sort of realization that you could notice from noticing a pattern, either in the real or in the conceptual, whatever, and apply it. And then it works somehow. And then it's a rule. And then it doesn't work somehow. And the exception becomes part of the rule. Davar halamed me inyano. A thing is learned from its context. And the word for context, in yan, implies an absence that has doubled into a context. Davar halamed me inyano, with that little yud to solidify it. Davar halamed me inyano. A thing is learned from its context. This is the 13th principle of wisdom of Rabbi Yishmael, noted co-inventor of the Kabbalah, according to one version, or at least two versions. I don't know. Depends which way. Well, he's attributed the Heichalot literature, the Heichalot of Rabbi Yishmael, but also the 13 principles of reason through which knowledge is derived. Arguably, one of the more objective accomplishments of the rabbis is come up with 13 principles, presumably paralleling some older proto-Hellenistic cipher, let's say, whatever that means, Well, the beginning of astrology and the beginning of all numerology is just counting up and just getting to certain things just from counting up, including the number of minutes that it makes sense to have a TV program for, because there's a very different experience of, let's say, a movie. If a TV show is an hour and a half, it's a movie, right? Can I still use words like that out there in TV land? Out there in TV land, a TV show that's more than 2 hours is certainly a movie, even if it's hasn't never been, played outdoors. And both the 1 hour and both the half-hour version of shows were given over in a very ancient way, in the same way that satyr plays in antiquity around the original development and conception of Greek theater through ecstatic, bacchanalia, give way to stories. First, the sort of miniature satyr plays like comedies, and then the longer epic tragedies, right? The longer epic tragedies. Sophocles, right? Creates it with a time meter in mind. Plays are a certain amount of time because they're made of time, because they're made of a window that's set for noticing something else. And according to the smallness of this window and the bigness of this window is so much of what we are in for when we start and stop watching something. So, like, let's say the push and the capacity in the new Netflix era to just binge almost makes it mandatory sometimes. So it's a nice challenge when we are not given that. And then we experience very viscerally how much the sluice of media is being given to us, like something we demand or need, much like food, much like anything, really. Much like anything. Much like anything, really. Three-body problem describes an adaptation from a Chinese sci-fi, arguably the most important Chinese sci-fi accomplishment of the 21st century. And I want to compare it to a couple other parallel sci-fi projects, the definitive ones of their, I want to say, intellectual culture and milieu in their way. The European miniseries The Swarm was a fascinating tikkun on apocalypse, not from the stars, but from the water. But Three-Body Problem, it's the stars, even as much as it's people, even as much as it's tech, even as much as the thing sounds like smartphone, it's aliens, straight up, from very far away, spatially defined. Early on, it's a mystery how the distance and what the distance between them being defined is, but eventually it's very defined because the fundamental presumption and underlying assumption in media orthodoxy globally is science. Is science as the relatively objective, which includes, human experience, which is so real. Human experience is just tremendously the only standard we have for the real because it resonates, because it feels right. And so, in The Birth of Tragedy, as described by Nietzsche, but let's say, he's quoting, the whole problem with media is how much it's carrying an orthodoxy. And the main challenge of being an individual, being a person, was to see past, as if. Whereas in Wagner, it's to see through, not just as if, but really to see through the heroic process into a catharsis. And thus all media really is much more based on Wagner than it is on Nietzsche. All critical review might be a little rooted in Nietzsche. And the standard that the story, let's say the presumptions of the stories may have a lot of Nietzsche, but Three Body Problem does an admirable and amazing and wonderful job wearing as many of its influences on its sleeve as it can. Every science thing and every media thing sort of being engaged and quoted, including just the range of aliens in a nerd's room, including just the range of books on people's shelves, including the Sabag Montefiore Jerusalem, to symbolize a redemption arc for someone through some kind of joke pivot in their relationship to their own cynicism. But let me please acknowledge here the challenge of adaptation, which is it's always polemical, and I dare say tends to be somewhat of a hostile polemical. Le mort d'auteur, the French are not really doing so well with the British when the story of King Arthur becomes canon amidst presumably oral legends and oral traditions. But the ultimate purpose and form and the ultimate pattern of a thing like a series is surely to be its own relationship to satisfaction. And one of the big differences between, let's say, the British pop and the French artistic tendency in media is grading against form versus surrendering to it utterly. Three Body Problem chooses nobly not the format and timing in the strictest way, as has been the pivot away in those sort of Netflixy options, but deep dives into relationship dynamics and was strongly criticized for this because this is a jump away from what the book was. And this parallels, I think, a bit the criticism and maybe uncriticism of its showrunners, Benoit and Weiss. I think many of us, very disappointed with the end of Game of Thrones as far as refusing to suggest a more creative, more natural, more, if n- I'm not want to say optimistic, but genuinely encouraging in light of the radical potential and association and affection people had for the sort of Khaleesi revolution, to learn that it's just not going to work no matter what because she's crazy. Very disappointing. And pivoted into, uh, if I remember that last episode of Game of Thrones correctly, pivoted right into Arya Stark creating colonization, creating settler colonialism. So I want to talk about the season and the time, the transition into Taurus from Aries. Whereas Aries is the beginning of all things and the initiator in the best and worst ways, Taurus is the reinforcer. And I want to notice how much the ancient language treats this as the massive horde of both soldiers and flocks, let's say, as different but similarly motivated measurements of wealth, measurements of capacity and power, just flocks and legions. Three-body problem is about, and all spoilers, is about the three bodies that intersect, that affect the gravity of an Earth. Let's say if there's one sun, okay, fine. Pretty stable, pretty cool. But if there's three suns, which I guess is a thing that could happen, the planetary bodies slung in between them can be slung and then shifted from one sun to another. And this is a perfect metaphor for the postmodern human experience. Everyone is people. There are no NPCs. Part of the challenge and fun of telling a media story is whose vantage points is being romanticized through. And according to this, is the humanity that's learned out and maybe triggered. And maybe, what's that Chomsky word? What's that Chomsky word for that thing they do when they want you to feel something? What's that called? Something you do to democracy to make it happen. It'll come back to me. Do you guys know this word? Engendering? No. There's a better word than engendering. Ah, it's on the tip of my tongue, you guys. Can you help me with this word? I want to say nope. Got it. Can't think of a word. It's all coming up dysentery. Because language fails sometimes to make the bridge between the new context and the last context. And lots of the cathartic purpose of media that we appreciate and love about it, that we yearn for it and appreciate it when it's done right, is to engage, on the one hand, the new, on the other hand, the familiar, and on the third hand, the implicit new language that is creating all of us together. A friend recently asked publicly, just on Facebook, like, how would you describe a Rebbe, you know? And I thought, just anyone you trust. Just can you imagine you have someone you trust, and because you do, it makes you who you are. And so media fandoms parallel ancient mystery cults in that there is a Gnostic revelation. It's the episode. There is a cult. It's the watching of the episode in the format. And alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, anything that humanizes us and makes us notice each other's being better, that's great. Now, the problem with three-body problem is that it is a Trojan horse for liberalism in a good way. Don't get me wrong. Liberalism über alles, the Reich will last on 1,000 years. I love liberalism. I love the fruits of it. I love what it's done for me and all the kids, I do love the kingdom, and I do love the ruling orthodoxy because I have not been as negatively impacted by the whole thing as other people have. There was space for my family to plan and function effectively, within it. We were not caught up in the exploitation or damage cycle. We were specifically avoiding, fleeing, being refugees eventually. Definitely fled from Eastern Europe back in the day, and definitely fled from Ecuador, just instability, just economic instability. There's always a reason to run. And that reason is defined alchemically in three-body problem, very profoundly, very deeply, and very initially before the rest of the narrative is expressed and clarified. They open with just the problem with just, woke communism, just the problem with a crowd who doesn't believe in truth. A crowd with an ideological position that demands a revoking of faith in either actual laws of physics, actual truths, as actual as truths can be, just renouncing those, the ways that you've come to understand things really are, just renouncing for social reasons because they're going to kill you, and equating that with being open to the possibility of existence of God. Now, this middle position, now, without the adding of the equating of faith in science with faith in the possibility of God, and defining the sort of wicked Marxism of Mao as anti-God and anti-science, as opposed to, let's say, maybe anti-something other than that, I'm so aware of and horrified by every atrocity under any system, especially ours, but especially theirs, but especially ours, but especially theirs. Part of the challenge of nationalism is the challenge of the power of war and conflict as initialization. And this is the beginning of art, but also the definition of all things. Heraclitus the Elder famously described how much war is the beginning of all things, the father of all things. And this is part of why the zodiac in every Eastern and Western tradition that I'm aware of starts with Aries, basically, starts with the springtime. Even Judaism, with a new year in the fall, actually starts its months with right now with springtime. But we're a little past that. We're all the way in that. And it's like one soldier in front is Aries, and then the legions that follow and become strong are Taurus. And this is part of why in the theology of the B'nai Yissaschar, the Vav and the He are Aries and Taurus. The four-letter name of God, right? Yud and He, and Wow and He, is the fundamental principle that I think we are talking through in this context, with the small Yud and the first He as the upper half of the divine name, the Father and the Mother, with the genderless grandparent, ancient of days, as the upper smallest tip of that little Yud. The smaller it gets, the closer it is to divine nothing. And so that little Yud at the beginning of the Yud He has a little top tip which is beyond distinction and division, and has the three jewels of will. But the will is just to see and experience, the real. And so the real, on the other end, is what media has to be based on, because it's the common language of the real, of the catharsis, and hence the tragedy beginning from not the triumph of the divinity. That's a comedy. See, Batman beat up the Joker. Phew. Osiris is triumphant after all. Well, bad example, right? Osiris is not triumphant. And in tragedy, the main thing is that the hero is so good because they don't win. And this is really the main definition of art as opposed to pop, right? It's tragedy because the hero doesn't have to win. It's not real, and maybe it's not cathartic if the hero wins. And so even Batman has to lose at some meaningful part of the story, sometimes for a long time, sometimes for an entire future. You could have Batman tragedies, but you can't have a realism that doesn't resonate. And so we return to the three-body problem and the tension and ambivalence in trying to do an adaptation that makes the ideological shift away from, being in China. Because Three-Body Problem is fundamentally a Chinese book, and it was adapted amidst what sounds like a very epic drama involving the billionaire donor who wanted to adapt it with Netflix just get murdered in some kind of internal sort of company conflict, maybe unrelated to the whole thing, and maybe deeply related. That's for other videos. This is about meaning and adaptation. And I'm going to say it quick in the context of the three worlds of the Kabbalah, right? There's different fundamental influences that, when they work together, are very empowering, are a sort of shared eclipse moment, and when they split apart, are the challenge of the distances, space, time, and feeling, right? You're far away. It was a long time ago. Sometimes you just feel very distant. And even noticing how distant or close one feels, there it is. 3 fundamental levels. And I want to relate these to the ideological levels implicit in a story that's basically a Trojan horse for liberalism, as opposed to and in some long term aspirational covenant with Chinese communism, or at least trying to supplant it in the knowledge of the people, using its own language. And I think of this as the fundamental, responsibility of exegesis, and it's a big part of what the show itself is about, and the book. Whereas in the book series, isolationism winds up triumphing as a blessing. That's not what they're doing in the movie, or in the show, I should say, in this Netflix adaptation. Isolationism is something one does almost nobly and accidentally. But the real thing is friends. The real main thing is science as dharma and the friends as the sangha, which I guess makes the aliens into the karma. But the aliens are identified with chaotic revolutionary refugee religion that affects the humans who become under the spell of the aliens. And this seems like such an aggressive, blunt metaphor for liberal fear of college activism in the modern era around Palestine and around, let's say, the things like Palestine, which is to say, local and global conflicts in danger of just being cruelly crushed by a state, which is one of the things that the show Three Body Problem problematically fundamentally romanticizes as just necessary. Through a British agency completely unidentified with either even Britain or any particular known agency, just some mystery agency above agencies, for some reason, some genuine collective of the high law enforcement that it turns out actually exists, fortunately, with science itself, with the scientists who are themselves idealists and humanists, even the worst of them, even the best of them, are just great, and when they die, it's very tragic. Three Body Problem suffers a little bit, not in grace and not in capacity, but in fundamental function, as basically about acknowledging pan Anglish fear of Islam specifically, but also socialism. It's been pointed out, I saw on anti-capitalist news, they don't mention Russia either. There's no Russia. There's one Russian scientist. It's very glaring. There's no Russian history. But that's okay. They're already doing China. Do they need to do the other thing? But there's no Muslims in the whole story, except in the context of a Hindu soldier really very okay with doing atrocities for the British Army, whose father proudly describes blowing up Pakistani enemy soldiers during the Kargil affair, Carlif War, one of those wars. In this scene where a soldier describes smilingly a strategy by which he was able to wipe out another unit in the Himalayas and take their oxygen, we are reintroduced and maybe even deeply introduced into the soldier boyfriend of one of the main scientist characters. We didn't really know he was a soldier. And very often in media, when someone's a soldier, it's just a thing they go and do. Everyone's a soldier. Because globally, a lot of people are soldiers, and it's just something they do, except to the degree that there is an underlying social narrative about who this character is. His name is Raj. And my first thought was like, oh, like the Raj that England set up, i.e., but no. Then I realized and thought, like Rajas, the martial principle. And this is, again, where Mars and Taurus become the beginning of nationalism in the self. I came up with a theory of the four sides of the chariot and the four sides of the zodiac as also reflecting four fundamental political organizing identities through which people organize in order to change anything for any purpose at all socially. To the degree that power is somewhere else, and within modern political forms, a range of identities can emerge specifically to overcome alienation. Because the alienated self, struggles. But as soon as you get together with other people, hey, it's much less of a struggle. You got a team. And I associate these with the four sides of the zodiac, the four sides of the chariot. The cow face in Taurus is nationalism. In its perfected form in Gemini, when most of the sort of more nationalist holidays are, within Gemini, between Taurus and Gemini, let's say, it's all about pride, the willingness to be who you already are, a fundamentally conservative impulse associated with the bull face on the chariot. I really want to think of Michael as the patron angel of nationalism and Gabriel as the patron angel of socialism, on the other end. But they tell me it's the other way around. I don't know. It really does seem like the Michael should be the patron angel of the, but there you go. No, Gabriel's definitely the bull. And the bull is about the mass that you are, right? What is fascism? You have a big crew, you're all together. What does it have in common with nationalism? Only that you have a big crew. And conversely, as it transforms into its sort of more celebrational aspect, performative aspect in Gemini, and then pivots back into a concern in Cancer, that becomes something more like socialism. Now, my initial theory was that the Leo was liberalism. No, I'm saying it wrong. I wanted to put the Leo as socialism until very recently as a reaction, friendly strength. But then I realized maybe that's not what it is. Maybe Leo is liberalism, Maybe in the same way that Taurus is nationalism, a sort of continued repetition of the things that feel good for the sake of the feel good. The Venus to the Mars of Aries, let's say. The celebrationalism of Leo is very encouraging. It's not condescending. Scorpio is condescending. And maybe socialism is more condescending than it is warm and supportive. That might be very regional, and that could be adaptive, right? Leo is traditionally a time for caution in Judaism because it's easy to get wiped out and burned out. But it's also the most important time for love and fixing broken dynamics between people. And that's, I'd say, the main virtue of watching episodes of shows. You can sit with people and you can understand people from a distance or closer together. Part of the challenge of Three Body Problem is how much the mystery of good martyrdom wanted to be a subplot. It's really weird, and they just kind of threw it in order to anchor the sense of a social responsibility within liberalism to love specifically so you won't be creepy and weird and awful. Because the characters, the scientists in Three Body Problem are not allowed to be creepy or awful. They're made of love and concern. A certain amount of performative brilliance, tremendous humility in a way that seems strangely and even disturbingly British, especially in the context of what should be relatively cynical scientists, curious to have a profound embedded idealism. But this is the good gospel of liberalism, that there is an idealism within the entire secularism that wants to save all our lives. And that is the lion face in a lot of ways. That is Leo in a lot of ways. But Aries and Taurus are a different thing, right? Whereas Aries is the hey, Taurus is the wow, the connecting extension that becomes the repetition. And the great thing about media is the repetition. More to follow.